I rise to speak on an amendment that is going to be offered, Lee Amendment 3897, that deals with the Federal Fair Housing Act. And I want to describe why I and many of my colleagues are opposed to the amendment. The amendment would eliminate the current affirmative furthering fair housing enforcement regulations promulgated by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I want to go into that. Mr. President, I'll start with a personal story. Before I was in partisan elective politics, I was a civil rights lawyer in Richmond for 17 years. And about 2/3 of my legal practice was fair housing cases. And I'll just tell you the story about my first client and 2 lessons I learned from my first client that bear upon this amendment. I had barely hung my diploma on the wall in my office, where I was the junior person among 12 lawyers, when a client was referred to our firm, and they did what is often the case. They sent it to the newest person, somebody who needed some help, pro bono assistance. And this young woman's name was Lorraine. Lorraine was almost exactly my age. I think I was 25 at the time. She was same age. I had just moved to a new city and just gone out to find my apartment in the new city and started my first real job, after school was done. And she was kind of in the same place, just out of college, just starting a new job, just looking for an apartment. Lorraine had been at work one day and had read in the newspaper an ad for an apartment in a neighborhood that she liked. And so she called the landlord and said, "Hey, I really am interested in your apartment. Is it still available?" "Yes, it's available." "Could I come over in my lunch hour to take a look?" "Sure, come on over." Well, about an hour later, she went over to the apartment, and when she met the owner looked at her and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, this place has just been rented." This was in the fall of 1984. Lorraine drove back to her office and had this sinking suspicion that maybe when the person saw that I was African American, that's why suddenly the available apartment turned into one that wasn't available. When she got back to the office, she asked a Caucasian colleague to make a call to the same owner and ask about the apartment. And within 20 minutes, the colleague had made the call and asked, "Hey, I'm calling about this apartment. Is it still available?" And the owner that had just turned Lorraine away said, "Sure, it's still available. When do you want to come over and see it?" That was the first lawsuit I drafted, and I know I'm speaking to a president who is an attorney and has done just the same thing. My first client that was truly mine, first pleading that I drafted, was a federal fair housing action for her. With the testimony of the coworker, it was a slam dunk case. We settled it shortly after we filed it. So in that sense, I don't have a big momentous trial story or anything to tell, but it nevertheless made a huge impression on me as a brand new attorney for 2 reasons. First, in hearing my client tell me the story, I understood more deeply than I ever had how important your home is, how important housing is. I think most of us feel like what's important in life is relationships, not things, not physical objects, but where you live is more like part of your person than it is a physical thing. And as she described this experience, obviously that was what made it so painful. But the thing that really stuck with me about it was this. She and I were so similar in many ways, about the same age, excited, be coming out to find a house and having a new job. But my experience, I found an apartment, no problem, for my wife and me, was a positive one. But Lorraine's experience of being turned away and then having this sinking suspicion, I'm turned away because of my skin color, and finding out that that was the case was a very negative and painful one. And what really struck me as I talked to her was this, that the pain was not just the pain of something in the past tense, the pain was also the anticipation. What about the next time I look for a house? What about the next time I go out? Am I going to be faced with this same differential in treatment because of the color of my skin? That first case I had, suddenly, Mr. President, made me the expert in Virginia on fair housing law, doing one case that was settled within a matter of weeks. And so for the next 17 years, this was the heart of my legal practice, representing people who'd been turned away from housing because of their race or their disability, apartments, houses, mortgages, homeowners insurance policies. And I learned an awful lot when I did it. And one of the things I learned was what a superb piece of legislation the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 is. It was the last of the major pieces of civil rights legislation that was done in the 1960s. You had the 1964 Act, which was public accommodations, employment discrimination. You had the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In 1968, the Federal Housing Act was really the last of those big pieces of federal legislation. And I'm proud to say that even over the course of my legal career, from 1984 until I stopped practicing in early 2002, in Virginia and elsewhere, there was some significant improvement. The Federal Fair Housing Act really did open the doors so that people could live where they wanted to live as their resources would allow them to live there. And yet, if you just look at the statistics about residential segregation in all 50 states, you would see that we still have more work to do. And there are still barriers that people face, and some of them are just absolute and sharp and clear barriers, and some of them are more subtle. HUD was directed by GAO in 2010 to do a study because they had been encouraged as part of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968 to encourage, affirmatively advance the fair housing mission through agencies that are funded by HUD. The case that I described with Lorraine was a private landlord, and that's not necessarily relevant to this topic except to underline how important the law is and how critical housing is. But in circumstances where HUD is giving funding to organizations, I was a mayor. My city had a housing authority. HUD funding went into the housing authority in my city, just like it goes into housing authorities all around the United States. I was a governor. Governors got CDBG funds that came from HUD. So whether it's to a city or to a county or to a state or to a CDBG program that then gets allocated out even to worthy and strong housing nonprofits, HUD was under a directive to, when it was funding organizations, to make sure that they were affirmatively advancing the commands of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And HUD was doing this sort of in fits and starts and in a little bit of a kind of a extemporaneous way. And in 2010, the GAO said, you have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, but you're not exactly doing it the right way. Can you really look at guidance that you can give to your grantees? Now, this was really important that federal grantees get this guidance and affirmatively further fair housing because it wasn't just the private landlords of the world that had done bad things in the housing industry. In fact, there had been a lot of policies of state, local, and even the federal government that had cut against fair housing. There were zoning laws that cut against fair housing. There were federal appraisal standards to get FHA loans that cut against fair housing. And there were other federal policies that actually cut directly against the goal of allowing people to live where they wanted to live. And so that's the reason why these grantees who are receiving federal money, who are in a unique position to do something about it, and often are inheriting a history where in the past they did the wrong things, that's why they need to be encouraged and given clear guidance about how to affirmatively further fair housing. And so to follow the GAO directive, HUD, under this administration, and I give Secretary Castro huge credit for kind of getting this to the goal line, did the work to come up with clear guidance so that those organizations that receive HUD funding know what it means to affirmatively encourage fair housing, and it's not just a vague platitude or something that you pay lip service to and you don't actually do it. The rule announced by HUD is pretty straightforward. It doesn't mandate changes to local zoning laws. It doesn't require people to move. It doesn't end local control of community planning and development. It allows communities to determine what the best strategies are to comply with the Fair Housing Act. It provides local communities with data and tools that are needed to make fair housing decisions, including allowing local communities to add any relevant local or regional data so that people can understand the effects of their actions. It does include protected classes in the statute in the larger community planning process. It prevents the use of federal resources to discriminate against protected classes of individuals. It simplifies compliance with the Fair Housing Act, and this is really important because a lot of small communities, they don't have a phalanx of lawyers to, pour through all the laws and regs, and so simplified compliance guidelines are helpful. It does not require grantees to collect new data that they're not already collecting. And it encourages engagement with the local community, including the real estate industry, residents, developers, and other organizations. I really think this guidance, as somebody who was sitting on the other end of this as a mayor, as somebody who was appointing members to a public housing agency in Richmond, I think this kind of guidance is actually very, very helpful. And so I was heartened when the GAO directed HUD to do this work. HUD did a significant period of study and put out guidance under Secretary Castro's leadership. And I think it's actually something that is helpful, not harmful, to those who are receiving HUD funds and should be using HUD funds to advance important goals, including the fair housing goals. And so I think the Lee 3897, I know, because I know the senator who's proposing it, that it's well-intentioned, and the intention might be, not to put too many burdens and obligations on the shoulders of local planning officials or cities or counties, but as somebody who's been a mayor and been in that spot, guidance is helpful. And I actually think this guidance gives clarity in an area where before the guidance there was some confusion. And I think the guidance strikes the right balance. And so that's why I don't know exactly when this is going to be called for a vote. I gather soon. But I just wanted to take the floor and hearken back to the days before I ever knew I'd be in politics, and I was representing people who desperately needed to just be treated equally to everybody else when it came to their housing. This HUD regulation really furthers that goal in a positive way, and I think we should not eliminate it by accepting Lee 3897. And so for that reason, I will encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.